Greetings. This lecture is on Africa. The geography of Sub-Saharan Africa offered few advantages to African peoples. Sadly, a major component of the wealth of various African kingdoms was the slave trade. Practiced in Africa since ancient times, slavery became especially profitable as the Atlantic and Islamic slave trades expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries. To better understand Africa, one must consider geography. Features of the African continent created difficulties for Africans to get ahead economically. This was especially true for the peoples of Sub-Saharan Africa. The African continent has the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and to the east, west, and south are the Indian, Atlantic, and Antarctica oceans. The Sahara Desert, encompassing most of North Africa, is vaster than continental United States. The remaining Africa to the south of the desert is Sub-Saharan Africa. Economist Thomas Sowell writes that for, quote, much of Sub-Saharan Africa, a combination of geographic features has had unfavorable, if not devastating, consequences for economic and cultural development and tragic consequences for the vulnerability of Black Africans to outside conquerors. The coastline of Sub-Saharan Africa is smooth and has very few harbors capable of handling ocean-going ships. Africa lacks coastal indentations that provide natural harbors where ships can dock and be sheltered from rough seas. Although Africa is much larger than the continent of Europe, its coastline is shorter than the European coastline and all other continental coastlines. The African coastline is approximately 26,000 kilometers, and that is much lower than, for example, North America, which is almost 300,000 kilometers, Asia, 230,000 kilometers. So the closest is Europe, but even still, Europe being smaller has longer coastline. More than a third of Europe's landmass are islands and peninsulas, whereas only 2% of Africa consists of islands and peninsulas. When Europeans began sailing around Africa to Asia to carry out international trade, they rarely made stops in Africa. Large ships could not get near the African shore. It was expensive to transport cargoes from ships anchored offshore. Smaller boats did the work, but it took time and many men to complete the task. The wind-driven ships returning from Asia also faced the challenge of wind and ocean currents. The weak participation in international trade hampered the development of Africa. There were difficulties beyond the shortcomings of the coast. Africa has a shortage of navigable rivers and streams, many of which run through escarpments and rift valleys. The coastal plains only averaged about 20 miles in width, hemmed by steep escarpments. The lack of regular rainfall kept shallow rivers unsuitable for transport. Problematic is that Africa is one of the few regions of the world lacking a single mountain range to collect snow. Without snow and the eventual snow melt, African rivers are at a disadvantage. One of the better African rivers to navigate, the Niger River, had an average depth of only approximately 12 feet during the dry season. This allowed barges up to 8 tons, but this compares terribly to rivers such as the Yangtze River in China, where ships now weighing 10,000 tons can go inland hundreds of miles. Larger rivers in Sub-Saharan Africa capable of handling bigger boats had rapids and waterfalls to prevent further sailing. So there were deeper rivers, and this would mean ships could go and transport up these rivers, but only to a certain point, because you'd run into rapids or falls. An example of that is the Congo River, formerly known as the Niger River. The Congo River is almost 3,000 miles long, and its volume of water is only second to the Amazon River. However, there are rapids and waterfalls on the Congo near the sea. Sub-Saharan rivers simply do not reach deep into the interior. These rivers, unlike the Nile River that allows passage far inland and facilitated the development of great cities. So when we compare Sub-Saharan Africa with what took place in Egypt, we can see quite the contrast. And of course, the city of Cairo comes to mind. The problem is that most of tropical Africa consists of high plateaus, and thus African rivers fall large vertical distances. Half of Africa is more than 2,500 feet above sea level. The Congo River or Niger River falls 1,000 feet compared to the Amazon River in South America that drops approximately 20 feet in its last 500 miles to the sea. Sub-Saharan Africa was denied the development of cities and the cultural universes around the navigable waterways. And I'll just read this historic description on the Congo River. This is taken from the 19th century. Before the first fall occurred, the river came gliding on smoothly with a glassy surface, and when it first met the rocks, it streamed over them almost unresistingly until, as if exasperated by repeated checks, in the last grand fall of the Yalala, it lashed itself into white and roaring fury, and the sound of its anger deafened one's ears, and the sight of its foam dazzled the eyes. The constant succession of falls and the obstructing rocks lashed the water into a state of indescribable fury. Now, this is describing the Congo River, but there were other rivers very much the same situation where you have these rapids and the falls. And so you just do not have very good rivers for navigation, for going inland. So this then affects the the development of cities, the fact that we don't see impressive cities developed in land at this time. Also, much of tropical Africa is more than 500 miles from the sea, whereas this is not the case with Europe. Western European lands are closer to the sea than 500 miles. Asia is the only continent that has a larger interior area remote from the sea, but this is not a problem for Asians. Asia has more navigable rivers from the interior to the coast. Transportation of people and goods in Sub-Saharan Africa was expensive for another reason: disease. The tsetse fly carried a fatal sickness for animals. In some regions, it was unrealistic to have pack animals and draft animals. With the tsetse fly, cattle would die. Now, without pack animals, Africans typically carried bundles on their heads. If items required a long trip, they had to be of enough value to make it worthwhile. Well, speaking long trip, of course, this is referring to the different trade routes and transporting commodities over land. So items had to be have significant value for it to make it worthwhile. There were only 3 commodities of small size that were clearly profitable: gold, ivory, and tragically, slaves. The lack of draft animals also meant a deficiency of much needed fertilizer for regions with poor soil due to low nutrient content and land erosion. Now, speaking of erosion, after long dry spells, sudden torrential rains washed away soil. And so we have disaster in these cases. Inferior conditions for agriculture force people to change locations often. Whole societies were unable, quote, to build territorially based communities with permanent structures. Many African peoples lived in isolation from non-African peoples, but also from other Africans. This isolation explains the proliferation of languages in Africa. Even though the African population only comprised about 1/10 of the world population, African languages accounted for 1/3 of all languages in the world. Many Africans lag behind the technological, organizational, and economic progress in other parts of the world. In his study on wealth and poverty, Thomas Sowell writes, quote, "Extreme linguistic diversity is not only a sign of social isolation and a resulting fragmentation, it contributes to the barriers separating African peoples from each other as well from the outside world." In many regions of the Sub-Saharan, powerful kingdoms controlled the lands. After local communities united, the Kingdom of Ghana emerged in the upper Niger Valley in the 5th century. It began its dominance in the 8th century, controlling and taxing the trans-Saharan trade. The biggest advantage was the gold located near its heartland. The kingdom benefited from having access to one of the richest gold-producing areas in all of Africa. In addition to gold, Ghana traded ivory, ostrich feathers, and slaves. The king of Ghana ruled by divine right, and he was assisted by a hereditary aristocratic class. The kingdom had a large army, but by the 13th century, the Mali Empire replaced Ghana as the major power in West Africa. Mali controlled the region from the Atlantic coast to the cities of Timbuktu and Goa. Mali had a profitable gold trade, and the region itself had enough moisture for successful agriculture. The Mali Empire welcomed Islamic teaching. Timbuktu became the site of a renowned mosque and schools of Islamic law and literature. From the 1200s to the 1400s, the Mali Empire benefited from the trade route that crossed the northern African continent and took African slaves to Muslim lands. When the Mali Empire began to weaken in the 15th century, the Songhei Empire became the dominant power in this region of Africa. Carrying on the imperial tradition of Mali, the Songhei Empire made great strides under the leadership of Sunni Ali, who ruled from 1464 to 1493. His army and navy were effective military forces. The Songhei leaders, like others before, were Muslim, but the Songhei Empire differed from the early empires by having a more successful political structure. Sunni Ali appointed governors to rule provinces. At the time of the Songhai Empire, the main city of Goa had 75,000 people. The Songhai participated in the lucrative trans-Saharan trade of gold and slaves. Changing economic times, especially the rising prominence of the Atlantic trade, caused the kingdom to weaken. The Songhai Empire fell in the late 1500s, the victim of an invasion by a superior Moroccan army in the year 1591. The Songhai army was no match for the Moroccans and their musket weapons. By this era, interior-based empires were at a disadvantage due to the growing Atlantic trade that siphoned wealth from the trans-Saharan trade. In the late 14th and early 15th century, the Portuguese began to expand its commercial activities, that is, Portugal. Portuguese rulers supported exploration ventures to the Atlantic coast of Africa. Portugal had a centralized government at a time when most other parts of Europe were politically fragmented. And thus, Portugal was directly involved in exploration. In this age, the Atlantic was known as the Ocean Sea. Throughout the 1400s, the Portuguese sailed further and further down the coast of Africa. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz set out to reach the end of Africa. Due to major storms, his ship was blown far to the southwest. After the storm, he sailed east but missed Africa. His men threatened mutiny and he was forced to return home. On the return trip, he glimpsed the tip of South Africa. And of course, this is would be the Cape of Good Hope. In the years 1497 to 1499, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama successfully sailed along the western and eastern African coasts and then across the Indian Ocean to India. In 1509, the Portuguese defeated Muslim naval forces in the Indian Ocean and were rulers of the sea, at least in the short term. The case of the Portuguese illustrates how some of the most important changes in history are brought about by smaller nations. In the late 1400s, the Portuguese began trade and diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of Congo in Western Africa. The kingdom had emerged in the 1300s when the Portuguese explorer Diego Cao arrived at the mouth of the Congo River in 1482. He expected a cool reception like those his countrymen had earlier received from West African leaders further north. But this was not the case. The Congo king, searching for allies, believed the Portuguese could help him consolidate his power. And of course, for these African people, they were looking for weapons that would give them military, that they could be military superior to the other African tribes who were their enemies. When the king died, when the Congo king died, one of his ambitious sons was Alfonso I. And he took over even though the custom was that the kingship should have gone to a nephew. Alfonso I converted to Christianity and encouraged his subjects to do the same. Alfonso attended Christian services and studied the Bible every day. The capital city of Mbanza had so many churches that it became known as, quote, Congo of the Bell. As was the case with other African kingdoms, the Congo kingdoms traded slaves for European goods. The Portuguese slave raiders traded with both allies and enemies of the Congo rulers, which weakened the king's authority, that is the king of Congo. In the 17th century, the relations between Congo leaders and the Portuguese worsened, and they fought each other in the year 1662 with the Congolese army unable to defeat the Portuguese. The Portuguese increased trade relations with the Kingdom of Ndongo, located south of the Kingdom of Congo. The Portuguese called this region Angola, and it looked to establish a colony to support large-scale trading in slaves. The remarkable Queen Nzinga, who reigned from 1623 to 1663, offered stiff resistance to the Portuguese. Fighting to keep the Portuguese from conquering Ndongo, her success was due to her ability to mobilize Central African peoples against the Portuguese. Although she experienced her share of success, her successors were unable to resist the Portuguese. Angola became the first European colony in Sub-Saharan Africa. However, the colony that would emerge as the most powerful in Sub-Saharan Africa was the Dutch Southern Colony. The Dutch established Cape Town in the year 1652, and in the 1700s, large numbers of Dutch moved to South Africa. The Dutch had settlements in the regions bounded by the Orange and Great Fish Rivers. With the advantage of modern weapons, the Dutch easily commandeered Africans to do their labor. Africans were often disunited, which assisted Europeans in their effort to control. Turning to religion, one sees that religious and social pressures went hand in hand with the political changes in Africa that resulted with the arrival of the Europeans. For example, the animistic African beliefs were challenged by Christianity. Both Islam and Christianity became popular in syncretic versions, and that is referring to the synthesis of the old and the new. So the synthesis of African religion with either Christianity or Islam. Even after their exposure to and adoption of Muslim beliefs, some African women continued to the tradition of not covering the top half of their bodies. Some Muslims demanded a pure form of Islam. The Fulani had been a pastoral farm people who adopted a strict form of Islam. In the 1600s, they settled in the cities and they mounted military campaigns to establish a pure form of Islam. Christians reacted forcefully against syncretic versions of Christianity. In the early 1700s, an aristocratic Congolese woman named Donna Beatrix claimed that a 13th century missionary possessed her and gave her messages to share with the people. She proposed that Jesus Christ was a Black African man, that the Congo was the real Holy Land, not Israel, but instead the Congo, and heaven was only for Africans. She told Africans to ignore the Christian teachings of European missionaries and instead follow her and her teachings. So, to no surprise, in the eyes of Christian leaders, this was heresy. The Congolese government, wanting to keep good relations with the Europeans, sentenced her to death by burning at the stake. It was important for Africans to have good relations with Europeans and have beneficial trade. Only by trade was there economic improvement. Trade brought new food crops to Africa. Of special importance was the manioc from the New World. The increased food supply caused steady population growth. And if we look at the years from 1500 to 1800, the population of the Sub-Saharan Africa rose from 34 to 60 million. This rise is notable when one considers the millions of Africans who were carried away as slaves. As important as trade was for Africans, an expanding slave trade resulted in horrors with countless victims. Since private property was not recognized in Africa, the ownership of slaves, as compared to land, stood as a measure of personal wealth. For centuries before the arrival of the Europeans, millions of Africans passed into the Islamic world as part of the trans-Saharan slave trade. With the arrival of the Europeans, Africans also began to be sent west. Slavery was an evil of widespread scope. West Africa was a major slave trading region. And we see that was a major slave trading region where Africans sadly enslaved other Africans. At the high point of the American slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves, quote, than they sent to the Western Hemisphere. On the other side of Africa, the Maasai were known for their expertise in slave raiding. Africans were more effective than Europeans in gathering up slaves. Whites involved in the slave trade in West Africa were as likely to catch malaria as to catch slaves themselves. White men spending time in the interior of Sub-Saharan Africa had an average life expectancy of less than a year. To improve their chances, Europeans or men from the Western Hemisphere who bought slaves stayed on the African coast and left as soon as possible. Staying on the coast and not participating in the capture and enslavement of Africans meant that many Europeans remained oblivious of the horrific details of slave raids. Once captured, Blacks experienced brutal conditions. There are no exact numbers, but estimates have 11 million slaves from the Sub-Saharan shipped to the Western Hemisphere, and anywhere from 14 to 17 million sent to Islamic regions. Whereas the Muslim slave trade had more women than men for harems throughout the Ottoman Empire, the Atlantic slave trade consisted of more men than women for plantation labor. So, concluding point. Africans fell behind Europeans and others not faced with the geographical challenges that the Africans faced. Sadly, slaves were one of the few commodities of value that could be transported in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.